And the GoPros are good to go. The GoPros are good. Hi, I'm John Herzer, and I own Blackfoot River Outfitters in Missoula, Montana. And I also designed the Strike boat that Sotar Manufacturing makes in Grants Pass, Oregon. I've been guiding for about 35 years. Every year, that's my only job, that's all I can do. It's kind of embarrassing if somebody does something for 30 years and that's all they've really learned. And I rode a boat the circumference of the earth twice. And I say that not to be arrogant, but to let you know that I know a little bit about rowing boats, and I actually think about boats a lot. I think about the design of the boats, and I think about how they float and how well they move, because to me this is my office. The Sotar boats, I started using those in the early 80s, and Sotar actually stands for state-of-the-art raft. And I realized that's just what it was when the owner of Sotar went on a whitewater rafting trip with me in central Colorado, a big class 5 river, and I was pretty arrogant little 18, 19-year-old punk, and I'd heard about these self-bailing boats where the water would come in and splash out, and but we'd never seen one. They had just been built for a few months, so he came and tested it with us, and we ran a class 5 run of the Arkansas River called the Numbers, and it was a very drastic run. It's continuous whitewater for 5 or 6 miles at that level. And we would run it sometimes in conventional boats, but you'd be bailing the entire time. So anyway, Glenn, the owner of Sotar, comes down to Colorado, and we hop in a boat together. And at the end of that run, I understood that Sotar was just that, state-of-the-art. We hit the biggest holes I'd ever hit in my life, and 50, 60 feet later, the boat would be empty. It would just bubble up to the surface, like holding a balloon underwater. It would just come up. It revolutionized rafting literally overnight, and that day literally changed the course of my life, I suppose, because I was using those boats the next year, and I've been using them ever since. I brought the first self-bailing boat to Montana, as far as I know. I remember people here in 1990, 91, they were saying that, oh, that guy's got a blue boat and it has holes in the bottom of it. They didn't even know what a self-bailer was. So we've been using these boats a long time, and the owner and I would discuss different designs and the way the boat's handled, and I would be complaining, oh, this one's too small in the front, this one's too wide, this one doesn't, it sits too low in the water, and finally he just said, why don't you design the perfect fishing boat, because all these are whitewater boats typically. He said, you design a perfect fishing boat and we'll build it to our exacting specifications. And so that's what we did, and after a couple iterations, that's what we've come up with is a Sotar Strike. And it looks different from any whitewater boat that you would see on the river that just has a fishing frame strapped on it, because it is different. It's designed with an angler in mind first, and as a whitewater boat second. So without further ado, I'm going to explain some of the distinct differences of the design of this boat versus others. So the Strike comes in 4 different sizes: an 11.5 footer, a 12.5 footer, 13.5 foot, and 14.5 foot. The 13.5 is kind of our standard. That's the one we use all the time for guiding in Montana. It's probably the best size. It was the first one we came up with because it utilizes the most space. It rides super shallow, and it runs very lightly down the river, as opposed to maybe the 12.5 footer does all those things, but it's going to be a little tight for 3 people. So the 13.5 footer is perfect design for a rower in the center, angler up front, and an angler in the stern. 14.5 is really nice. It still floats super high because it's a bigger boat, but if you're going to do a little bit more whitewater, you want to go on the Salmon River or something like that, it's an exceptional boat because you can have a bigger payload, it's wider, and it's longer, and it fills more gear, and you can run through heavy whitewater with it. The 11.5 is pretty much built for 2 people. You can put a third person in it, but it's not exactly designed for that. It's for small streams and little creeks that you might want to row and fish down those. The primary differences in design of the Strike versus other rafts are first and foremost, that the bow and the stern are asymmetrical. So you look at most rafts and they look like this. And they've got 20-inch tubes for a 13.5-foot boat. They'll have 20-inch tubes here, 20-inch tubes around this way, and they're kind of turned up bow and stern. That works really well in whitewater, but when you're fishing, there's some shortcomings to that. When I'm rowing the boat, if I'm in the center here, I can see any kind of object that I want to miss or go right beside. It's right there. If I have a great big tube that's sticking up in bow and in the stern, I can't see it on the back end, I can't see it on the front end. My typical rowing position to be here, I can see literally 2 feet in front of the boat. So the flat profile is critical to this boat. In the back end, we want the back a little bit bigger. We still want it low so the whole profile is super flat, keeps out of the wind that way. But a little bigger, because if you have a big guy in the back of your boat and you have an anchor system hanging off the back, then you need a bigger tube to hold that flotation, to maintain that flotation a little bit. So having just a symmetrical boat with a little, this one here actually is 19 inches here, 14 inches in the front, and 16 inches in the stern. If you just had 14-inch tubes in the bow and the stern, the back end would crease a little bit, and when you're at anchor or when you're rowing back up against the current, it would dip slightly if you have some weight in there. So the overall profile of the boat is pretty flat, and the upturn is down on the bottom of the boat instead of up on the top. So this does two things. One, it keeps the boat shallower. More surface of the boat is on the water, so it rides over shallow riffles a lot easier. And also, obviously, if you have a big bow and a stern with a 20-inch tube here, it's like a sail. So you get blowing around the river a lot. We're not worried about getting some water splashed over the front end. I've run class 4 in these, and that's fine. Probably class 5 rivers you could run them too, but you're going to get wetter. It's going to be a wetter ride because we don't have a great big tube up front. But for our purposes as a fishing raft primarily, we are not going to ever have any weight in the front, so we don't need the bow really big. We want that really small, cuts through the wind, and we can see easily. In the back, just slightly bigger, because then when we want to row backwards, it keeps the flotation up a little bit. The overall length on a 13.5 footer is 84 inches of boat on the water. And the reason we want quite a bit, if you think of a skiff, a fly fishing skiff that you would use in Florida or out in the Everglades or something that you would be pulling for redfish or tarpon and bonefish, you want something really long and narrow so it stays up super shallow but still turns. You can turn it pretty easy. So that's what this boat does. It stays up. It's long and narrow, and it rides up nice and high. If you have one of these boats, the standard turns up bow and stern steeply, then the tendency is once you put a bunch of weight in there, that boat goes down in order to compensate for that weight. So this is going to spread the weight out a little bit more. The boat is a self-bailing boat, which pretty much all rafts are these days. When I first started rowing, there were no self-bailing boats, but today it's pretty standard. Now typically you want to keep the wet side down when you're in a boat, but sometimes it's nice to be able to flip the boat over and see what exactly going on the bottom of it. So this is the welded I-beam floor. This is going to give you great tracking, and this is the little flange that covers up these little grommets. Down here you have tubular webbing, and the floor is actually a separate entity. You could just take it out and the boat would be like a donut. You lace this thing in. It takes a couple hours. It's not easy. You get it all laced in nice and tight, and then these flanges cover these brass grommets. Originally, like in the 80s probably, a long time ago, they didn't have this cover on here, and a lot of times we tore those grommets out going over whitewater runs, and there'd be rocks jagged rocks would grab onto that. But today's boats, this thing is just super slick, and the material's the same. It's this Lexitron material that's like plastic, a hard plastic, so it just slides right over the rocks. These are an I-beam floor, so they're kind of rigid. They have little bumps in them, and that keeps the rigidity. If you didn't have those, they're kind of glued together in tubes. If you didn't have those, it'd be just one big bubble, and the floor would be like a big bubble sticking up. So that gives it rigidity, and also what it's really nice for is it tracks very well going down the river. So when you're rowing and you see a fish rise against the bank and you put on the brakes, the boat doesn't have a tendency to slip back and forth. It's just going to hold steady in that current line that you've chosen to go down there. so that you can crab crawl quite easily with it. It still slides nice, but it stays on a single plane down the river. And I think those I-beams do well at giving you an advantage for that. Most of the boats come standard with these D-ring placements. You can have those changed anywhere you want, but typically we're just going to run a frame from here around the back. We have different frames, and we'll talk about those a little later, but we run those around the back and up to this side, and then as you can see, there's no weight in the front, so we don't have any of this little extra cover here. What this is for is it gives a little bit of grip. It's almost like if you took paint and with some sort of texture on it. So the boats are really slick, and that's another thing to talk about. This texture gives it a nice grip, so if you grab it with your boots, it doesn't slip. If you do this, you can slide off. The great thing about Sotar boats is they are made of Lexitron, which is a urethane-based boat. So it's like a plastic. It makes it nice and slick. It slides over rocks really easy, as opposed to a Hypalon or a rubber-based boat. You think of your tires, so you don't want those slipping, and they're made of rubber. That's what other boats, a lot of different boat manufacturers use. They're super tough, and there are some great boats out there with those with a Hypalon base. But for our purposes, we want something super slick, so we can drag. If we come down a little channel and there's a log there and I have to grab the boat and drag it over by myself, I can do that pretty easy. Also, if I'm going over some riffles and a little gravel bar, I want to be quiet. That's why I'm not using my drift boat. And I want it to run real shallow, and it'll just go right over those things, and because it's slick, it's going to slide right over the rocks, much easier than a rubber boat would. So another consideration that the asymmetrical bow and stern provide is more space in the boat. It's clean. We don't sell them with any thwarts or strap potential for thwarts. You could strap some thwarts to the floor if you wanted to, but it's primarily a fishing boat, so it doesn't come with thwarts. Well, I don't know if you know, a thwart is something that crosses the boat, and then you put your foot under it for stability if you're paddling. So it doesn't have any thwarts, which keeps it inside is super clean. All right, so there's nothing for your line to tangle on. You don't want any buckles or any little D-rings or anything on the inside of the boat. You certainly don't want a thwart in there, because the line invariably gets stuck in between the thwart and the main tube. It gives us a lot of space now, and it's clean space in the bow and the stern. Probably 15 to 20% more space for payload than any other boat that has a symmetrical bow and stern. And it's super light. So this boat weighs just under 100 pounds, about 97 pounds for a 13.5 footer. You can just pick it up. It's quite light. There isn't much weight to it. And inside, we can take a look. Some people don't like the I-beams because they feel that they're uncomfortable to stand on. They're not quite flat. And we've resolved that problem. Anytime somebody really wants to stand in the boat, which we've got frames designed, they shouldn't really stand in the boat. But if you prefer to stand in the boat, you can just put a sheet of marine grade plywood in the bottom, and it's fine. We just cut it out to fit, and we've had some people that are in wheelchairs and stuff like that. We can just pop those right in here too. So we just put a little hard floor over it. It's not going to hurt the floor at all. There's 9 inches of space between you and the rocks, so it's not going to hurt the boat either. You can see that it's nice and clean. There's nothing to be tangled on in the bow or the stern. All right, and super light. So the boat, strongest material there is, doesn't weigh anything. So it's 40 ounce, 3,000 denier material. So the puncture resistance exceeds any other boat on the market. Over the years, I've been really fortunate to be in a lot of boats, and I've thought a lot about the design of boats and the nuances of what makes a boat run shallow or deep, or what makes it spin really quick. So when we're designing the Strike, we really brought all those lessons to bear. In addition to being asymmetrical bow and stern, also real distinct consideration is a length to width ratio. If you have a boat that's wide but not very long, then it floats up nice and high, but it rides like a donut, and it just kind of spins around in the river, and it's hard to track. If you have one that's too narrow, those track really nice. They tend to run a little too deep because you can't put enough weight in them. You don't have enough floor to displace the amount of water that you need to keep a crew of 3 people in gear up high enough. So if you're out there shopping for a raft for fishing, make sure that you compare apples to apples. Make sure you're comparing the highest end boats to the highest end boats, because that's what this is. The Sotar is kind of like buying a Toyota, the way I figure it. I have a Tundra, and that's what I always will have as a fishing guide. I can't ever accept having any kind of a breakdown, and with a Sotar I don't ever expect to have a breakdown. And the resale value is similar to a Tundra too. You pay a little more up front and you get it all back in the end. Another thing to consider is that when you put this with a nice fishing frame in here, it's going to row more similar to a drip boat than most rafts. It's going to be lighter on the water, quick, very responsive, and it's going to be a lot quieter than a drip boat. If you're in a drip boat, it isn't very forgiving. You hit rocks sideways or something like that, the boat really lurches. Rafts are super forgiving. They take a lot more abuse than a drip boat, and for beginning rowers, they're much safer. The bottom line is, if you want to catch more fish, you want to get a Blackfoot Strike.